Which of the following is used to reverse the effect of local anesthesia in a pediatric patient to avoid the self-inflicting injury due to the anesthesia? So the options given were procaine, EMLA, phentolamine mesylate, and petroleum jelly.
So here see the options. So here reversal of LA is asked. So out of these, the answer is phentolamine mesylate. Okay. So now see, you can find this here in subject oral surgery under the chapter local anesthesia. There is a bite which mentions it. Topic local anesthesia. Bite is complications of LA. Now you can see here EMLA, eutectic mixture of local anesthesia. That is also explained very well. And this line is written there, reversal of local anesthesia can be done by phentolamine mesylate. So this one was the direct answer. Okay, this was the direct question which was asked in a clinical form. Okay, so you should know what is the use of this phentolamine mesylate and when it is used. This phentolamine mesylate is a switch off of LA. Okay, this is a switch off LA. Clinical indications for reversal of local anesthesia. Now this is used for reversal of local anesthesia. So when it is indicated that reversal should be done. So administration of phentolamine mesylate should be the treatment option when prolonged soft tissue anesthesia presents a potential risk or soft tissue injury or will negatively impact the patient's lifestyle. That is inability to speak or eat. Okay. So the potential candidates who are given, who require this reversal of local anesthesia, these are generally pediatric patients, medically compromised patients, geriatric patients, special needs patients, and post-mandibular implants also it is given. Okay, so now here you see this is a pediatric patient. Okay.
This phentolamine mesylate is available in a branded name of Oravus.
This is also a question only. This Oravus, this was also asked in a recent exam. Okay, so you should know the brand name also, how this is marketed as. Okay, so see, I told you the potential candidates. There was pediatric patient, geriatric patient. So here in the question, pediatric patient is mentioned here and reversal of LA is mentioned here. So answer will be phentolamine mesylate. Now we'll see the next question. See, which of the following bias is due to different admission rates for different diseases? Okay, so see the options. First option was Parkinsonian bias. Another option, community bias, telescopic bias, and the last option was Neyman bias.
Now we'll see what is this Parkinsonian bias. This Parkinsonian bias is covered in the question bank. The four options were: first option was presence of confounding factors. Second option was different admission rates for different diseases. Third option was bias introduced by investigator. And the fourth option was patient cannot recall or give false information. Out of this, the second option was correct. And what is this? Basically, this Parkinsonian bias is hospital rate bias. So this Parkinsonian bias is covered in bites also under the chapter epidemiology. It's known as admission rate bias. It is due to hospital cases and controls that are systemically different from each other. So in this Parkinsonian bias, there may be a spurious association between a disease or between a characteristic and a disease because of different probabilities of admission to a hospital, or for those with a disease, without a disease, and with a characteristic of interest. And this Parkinsonian bias is otherwise called hospital selection bias or fallacy bias. And this is a type of selection bias. We have other types of bias such as telescopic bias, post hoc bias, attention bias, lead time bias, and Neiman bias.
Okay, you should know the other names also because maybe you'll be getting questions on other types of bias. Basically, Hawthorne effect. This you should know. This is a very important question which appears from here. Hawthorne effect. Study subject may systematically alter their behavior when they know that they are being observed. Okay, so this is also a question. This is also mentioned here only. Lead time bias. This is zero time shift bias. Bias of overestimation of survival time due to backward shift and starting point by screening procedure. And there was another option, Neiman bias. This is prevalence incidence bias. You should know the other names also. Like here, late time bias is zero time shift bias, and Neiman bias is also known as prevalence incidence bias. This is the bias due to missing of fatal cases, mild silent cases of short duration of episodes from the study. Okay, so see, like doctors, can you give an example of this Parkinsonian bias?
Yeah, this is due to the spurious association, as we told. So now we'll take an example in a case control study looking at a relationship between this direct and deep vein thrombosis and oral contraceptives. See, as general physicians, they know about a possible link between this OC and deep vein thrombosis patients. So women with suggestive symptoms and no use of oral contraceptive were morely like to be referred to the hospital with deep vein thrombosis. So this could lead to an overestimation of the effect of oral contraceptive on deep vein thrombosis patient. So oral contraceptive patients may be falsely associated with deep vein thrombosis. So this type of cases are known as Parkinsonian bias.
Okay, so here the answer will be Parkinsonian bias.
In the exam, an IBQ was there. In the given image, A and B are. See the diagram. There were parts marked A and B. First option was fenestration dehiscence. Second option was dehiscence and fenestrations. Third option was both are dehiscence. Fourth was both are fenestration.
So here you have to identify. You have to identify that which one is fenestration and which one is dehiscence. Okay, so here this is A and this is B, and the answer was this was dehiscence and this is fenestration. Okay, so option 2 was correct. Now we'll see the same question, the exact same question is there in the question bank in the subject periodontology. The same image is given, the same options are given, everything is the same. Okay, so here also the answer was dehiscence and fenestration. This one is dehiscence and this one is fenestration. Now we'll see what is dehiscence and what is fenestration. See, the isolated areas in which the root is denuded of bone and the denuded of the bone, root is denuded of the bone and the root surface is covered only by periosteum and overlying gingiva, that is known as fenestration. Okay. Now, dehiscence. What is dehiscence? Dehiscence is denuded areas extend through the marginal bone. Defect is called the dehiscence. So this one is dehiscence. Okay. And this one is fenestration here. Okay, so now you can differentiate. This is the dehiscence on the canine, dehiscence on the canine, and fenestration on the first premolar. Okay, so see the question. So now you can identify here A represents the dehiscence, B represents the fenestration. So your answer will be dehiscence and fenestration.
Next, an IBQ was asked in the exam. Identify the following instrument. First option was number 17 and number 23. Second option was number 3 CH pigtail and number 17. Third option was number 3 CH pigtail and number 23. And fourth option was number 23 and number 17.
Okay, now see here, this is an IBQ and you should be able to at least identify what instruments are there. Okay, so here number 17 and number 23 is the answer. Okay, so see the options, number 17, number 23, number 3 CH pigtail. So here the options are just reversed. So you should be very clear to identify this is number 17 and this is number 23. Okay, so see, this is given the subject periodontics, chapter periodontal instruments. Under the topic periodontal instruments, you get a bite, diagnostic periodontal instruments, where it is very nicely explained. All types of explorers are there. So the use of explorers, that they are used to locate the subgingival deposits and carious areas and check the smoothness. Okay, so see this, you can you should be able to identify. See here in the subscripts written like this is number 17. Okay, this is number 23. These two images were asked in exam. Okay, you may expect the other images as well, because you should see the other options. This one is the pigtail, where it is mentioned in the options. Okay, so you should be able to identify this also, and you should be able to differentiate between all these. And also you should know the functions. What is the use of the explorer? The use is, it is used to locate subgingival deposits and carious areas and to check the smoothness of the root surface, and it is designed with different shapes and angles. Okay, so now here the option is number 17 and number 23.
CPI-TN index is used to assess. First option was degree of periodontal destruction. Second option, the amount of calculus present. Third option, the treatment needs. And fourth option was degree of inflammation of the gingival tissues.
Okay, so now see the options. So here CPITN, that stands for Community Periodontal Index of Treatment Needs. Okay, so it includes the treatment needs. It is used to assess the treatment needs. So answer here will be treatment needs. Okay, so now see, similar question was there in the question bank in public health industry under the chapter indices. See here also the question is I think the question is exactly same question is there. See, CPIDN index is used to assess the degree of periodontal destruction, amount of calculus present, the treatment needs, the degree of inflammation of gingival tissues. So yeah, the answer was treatment needs. Okay. Also, you can find this in bites also. See, in public health dentistry only, subject public health dentistry, you can see the chapter indices topics, synopsis part 2. This is indices part 2. You find community periodontal index of treatment needs. It is explained in detail. Okay, and all of this is important. You should know this is CPITN, the full form of CPITN. This is all. This is very important. This is also a question. Okay, it was developed for the joint working committee of the World Health Organization and Federation d'Intérêt International, WHO or FDI. It is a screening procedure. It is a screening procedure for identifying actual and potential problems posed by periodontal diseases, both in the community and in the individual. So it has certain advantages and limitations. So you should know the advantages and limitations also. This may be also asked in exams. Okay. So see the advantages. The advantages are its simplicity, its speed, and international uniformity, whereas the limitations are it does not record the position of the gingival margin and it does not provide assessment of past periodontal breakdown. Okay. So
We have to know about the CPITN probe also. So this probe was first described by WHO. So this probe was initially used for two purposes. One was the measurement of pocket depth and one was the detection of subgingival calculus and bleeding. The most important part of this probe is the markings. We have two probes, C and E. This C or the clinical probe has black markings between 3.5 and 5.5 and between 8.5 and 11.5. CPITN E probe contains markings at 3.5, 5.5, 8.5 and 11.5 with a ball tip of 0.5 diameter. So this is only important. We have two probes, C and E. C is a clinical probe and E is used for epidemiological purposes.
okay, and also you should know the full form of CPITN. Also, this CPITN probe is also the name is TRS 621. This also you should know. Okay, these are potential questions which may be asked apart from this question. So you should know all of these. So now here coming back to the original question which we were discussing, this is CPITN index is used to assess. Here the answer is the treatment needs. Now see here a question was there on a classification of cleft lip and palate, and this is a new one, Nagpur classification. Nagpur classification was asked. According to Nagpur classification, cleft lip with cleft palate is categorized under options are group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4.
This question is asked in question bank. Nagpur classification is used for which of the purposes? Cleft lip and palate, tumor staging, neurological assessment of trauma patients, and none of the above. So this Nagpur classification, it is categorized into three groups. Group 1 is cleft lip only and it is subdivided into group 1A and 1B. 1A is cleft lip alveolus and 1B is subsurface cleft lip. Group 2 is cleft palate only and group 3 is cleft lip and palate. So according to the question asked, according to Nagpur classification, cleft lip with cleft palate is categorized under group 3. Dengue fever vector is first option Anopheles, second option Aedes, third Culex and fourth is Mancini.
Now here out of these options, the answer is Aedes. Okay. Now see the same question, exactly same question is there in the question bank in the subject microbiology under the subject chapter virology. Okay. See the same question was there. Dengue fever vector is a Anopheles. This is what vector? This is Anopheles, Aedes, Culex, Mancini. So same question is here. The vector for dengue fever is asked in the exam. So answer would be Aedes. You should know the other options as well. Anopheles is a vector for malaria, Culex, a vector for filariasis, Aedes, vector for dengue.
Mancini causes encephalitis, so the best option here would be Aedes.
Now see, a question was there. The patient has a nasal fracture. What will be the test for confirmation of CSF leakage? Okay, so here nasal fracture and the test for confirmation of CSF leakage is asked. So we'll see the options. Option 1 was CT scan. Another option, decreased glucose, then increased glucose. And last option was transferrin beta.
So the best option here would be transferrin beta. Now we'll see what are the similar question was asked in oral surgery question bank. The question was, a 35-year-old man with Lefort-3 fracture complains of a blood-tinged watery discharge from his nose 2 days after the trauma. CT scan confirms nasoorbital ethmoidal fracture as well. So what investigation is most confirmatory for detecting the CSF leakage? Basically, both these questions are asking what is the confirmatory test for the CSF leakage. So the options were CT scan, MRI scan, presence of glucose in the fluid, presence of transferrin beta. First two options you can eliminate very easily, but looking at the third and fourth option, now we'll learn about this transferrin beta. If you see, this transferrin beta is majorly present in cerebrospinal fluid.
Now see, to facilitate the diagnosis of CSF leak, a few drops of the fluid can be placed on a tissue. Okay. Now since the CSF has a more rapid diffusion, it has a more rapid diffusion than blood, leading to a larger, clearer CSF ring. Now this is diagnostic, this you should know. Clearer CSF ring surrounding a sanguineous central ring. This is termed as double ring and halo sign. Now this is itself a question, halo sign, double ring sign. Okay. So this is due to the more rapid diffusion of CSF than blood, and it forms a ring. Now, laboratory tests for CSF detection, they include the presence of glucose oxidase, CSF glucose levels larger than 30 mg per dl, protein content less than 2 gram per liter, and detection of beta-2 transferrin. Now, this was our option, beta-2 transferrin. Okay. Fractures involving the posterior table of the frontal sinus or the cribriform plate may cause the CSF leakage. Confirmation of the presence of CSF can be made by collecting as little as 0.1 ml of this blood and comparing glucose and chloride levels in the fluid with the patient's serum levels. Okay. Now see what are the chloride and glucose levels in comparison to serum. High chloride and low glucose concentrations in the fluid which are compared to serum indicate the presence of CSF. Okay. So in addition, the presence of beta-2 transferrin in the fluid confirms the presence of CSF. Now see here, we'll see here glucose. Glucose is 58 to 90. Serum, it is 80 to 120. So in comparison to serum, the glucose is less in CSF. Okay. And see, beta-2 transferrin. Now this is percentage of total transferrin, beta-2 transferrin. This is around 15. 15% it is there in CSF and it is not present in serum and nasal secretions. Okay. So now we see the question. Here, see, it is asking the test for confirmation of CSF leakage. So here, out of the options, the best option would be transferrin beta-2 mark. Okay. So here answer will be as transferrin beta. Now we see another question. See, mucocele. Mucocele, important question. It was asked in the exam. Mucocele is most commonly seen on. The site was asked here. So see the options: floor of the mouth, upper lip, lower lip, and hard palate.
We see the exact question in oral pathology and medicine question bank. See, mucocele is most frequently seen on upper lip, hard palate, lower lip, and buccal mucosa. The best option here would be lower lip. Now we'll see what are the important things about mucocele. This mucocele is otherwise known as mucocele and mucus retention cyst. It is a mucus retention phenomenon. Here we have two phenomenons. One is a retention phenomenon and one is an extravasation phenomenon. Mucocele is mainly of two types. Mucus extravasation type, which is called true mucocele. This mucocele, wherein the saliva leaks into the submucosal tissue through a lacerated minor salivary gland duct, causing pooling of mucus, resulting in inflammation and formation of the granulation tissue. So this extravasation type is far more common. We have another phenomenon where this is called mucus retention type, which is called salivary duct cyst. This is less common, caused by the obstruction of a minor salivary duct, which causes backing up of saliva. This continual pressure will dilate the duct and form a cyst-like cavity, and these are lined with the epithelium. So it may commonly affect two parts. One is it may affect any part of the oral cavity where the accessory salivary glands are present. Second, it presents as bluish or translucent submucosal swelling, most common presentation. And third will be the rupture, collapse, and refilling of the swelling may be present. And what will be the etiology of the retention cyst? Mostly due to the obstruction of the salivary duct, causing retrograde pressure on the duct walls by collected saliva, thus causing a ballooning of the duct or ductal calculi. So the best option here would be lower lip.
Now we have another question. See the question. Which of the following studies gives the best evidence for treatment? Okay, so the options were cross-sectional study, cohort study, case control study, and randomized control trial was the fourth option.
So out of these options, randomized control trial gives you the best evidence for the treatment. We have a similar question in public health dentistry, chapter epidemiology, where in question bank it's asked highest level of study among the following is. We have given four options. First option was systemic cohort, next is case control cohort, next next is systemic reviews, and one is meta-analysis. In clinical research, the best evidence for treatment efficacy is mainly from meta-analysis. Now, how will we arrive to this conclusion? Here in this question, it is meta-analysis. So there is an evidence-based pyramid in medicine. So if you look at this pyramid, there are subcategories into it. The first category from the bottom, we have to see it from the bottom. So from the bottom, it is an expert views, then case series and case research. Next will be your observational studies, then non-randomized control studies, then randomized control studies, and systemic reviews and meta-analysis. Now, always you have to categorize this quality of studies from bottom to top. So bottom will be of a lower quality and upper will be of the highest quality. So coming back to the question again, see which of the following studies give you the best evidence for the treatment. So among this, we have seen the options cross-control study, cohort, case control, randomized control. Among this randomized control trial will give you the best evidence as it is seen in the top of the table. We have a question about the epithelium. Skin is composed of, the options were simple squamous epithelium, columnar epithelium, cuboidal epithelium, pseudostratified columnar epithelium.
So the answer here was simple squamous epithelium. Okay. So now you see in subject anatomy under chapter miscellaneous topic histology, we have a bite types of epithelium. Okay. So you can find there all types of epithelium, all types of layers. Okay. So see epithelium, function of epithelium is a barrier protection, and stratified squamous is there present in epidermis. Locations you should know: epidermis, oral cavity, and esophagus. Okay. So here in the bite figures are also given, and very nicely all epithelia are given. See stratified squamous, it is there in epidermis, oral cavity, and esophagus. Function is barrier and protection. Stratified cuboidal is there, sweat glands, ducts. Okay, large ducts of exocrine glands, barrier, acts as a conduit. Similarly, stratified columnar, it is there present in largest ducts of exocrine glands, anorectal junction, also acts as a barrier and conduit. So you should know all of these. Okay, anyone may be asked in the next exams. Okay, transitional epithelium, it is also known as urothelium. Now this is present in renal colysis, uretus. Okay, ureter, bladder, urethra, and barrier property plus another important property, that is distensible. Okay, urothelium is distensible. So it is there in the bites. And now see again, skin is composed of simple squamous epithelium. So this is the best option here. So this will be the answer. Here we have another question, a combination based question where match the following was asked. So here you have to match the drugs on this column to this column. Okay, and correct combinations have to be selected from the options here. Okay, so see, match the following: A, B, C, D. Drugs were written like vancomycin, ceftazidime, metronidazole, and ciprofloxacin, and the organisms were written 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1 Haemophilus, Bacteroides, methicillin-resistant staph, and Klebsiella pneumoniae. Now the combinations were there. See, the combinations were A, A3, B4, C2, D1, B, A2, B4, C2, D3. Now you have to match it accordingly. Okay, C was A3, B2, C4, D1, and D was A3, B1, C2, D4. Now the correct option among these was A3, B4, C2, D1.
So this chemotherapy A, it's very important for exams. Many questions will be asked on this chapter. In our Pharmac bites, cephalosporins is covered very nicely. All the generations have to be learned thoroughly. Now we'll see about each drug and few notes on it. So if you see the first option, vancomycin, it specifically acts on MRSA, methicillin resistant staph, and the mechanism of action will be inhibition of protein synthesis. Ceftazidime, it's a third generation cephalosporin. It acts against this Klebsiella pneumoniae. This third generation has a wide coverage for this Klebsiella pneumoniae. Metronidazole, as we all know, it acts against the anaerobes. So bacteroids will be the right option here. And if you see the ciprofloxacin, it's a quinolone derivative. It acts mainly against this Haemophilus. So looking about this drugs and the organisms, we can just match the following. See, vancomycin acts against MRSA, ceftazidime acts against Klebsiella pneumoniae, metronidazole acts on bacteroids, and ciprofloxacin acts on Haemophilus. So the right option will be A3, B4, C2, and B1.
Now we have a question on therapeutic monitoring. See, this is important question. A patient is on long-term penicillin and he was subsequently given gentamicin. Now therapeutic monitoring is must. Why is it so? Now statements were given as options. See, gentamicin has narrow therapeutic index. Penicillin has narrow therapeutic index. Penicillin should be stopped as it causes anaphylaxis, and both should be stopped.
So this question on gentamicin was covered in pharmacology, chapter chemotherapy, topic aminoglycosides and bite under drugs. So this gentamicin, as we know, it belongs to aminoglycoside. It is the most potent aminoglycoside. It has a broader spectrum, but the only disadvantage of this drug is it has a very narrow therapeutic index. What does this therapeutic index mean? This therapeutic index basically means the relative safety of a drug. So compared to penicillin and gentamicin, this gentamicin is relatively not safer to get administered. And what are the uses of this gentamicin? It is used in the prophylaxis of bacterial endocarditis. It is effective against gram-negative spectrum, and it is also used topically for the gram-negative ear, eye, and skin infections. Now coming back to the question, first option, gentamicin has narrow therapeutic index. As we have already discussed what is therapeutic index, we can choose this as a right answer, but we have to rule out the other options as well. Penicillin has narrow therapeutic index. No, it has a wider therapeutic index. It can be administered to a variety of conditions. Penicillin should be stopped as it causes anaphylaxis. This doesn't correlate to the question as well, and both should be stopped. It is a wrong option. So the best option here would be gentamicin has a narrow therapeutic index.
Now in this question, the patient had hypoplasia. This is a clinical question where some clinical scenario is given. Okay, so we have to see. Now patient had hypoplasia, microdontia, hypodontia, multiple unerupted teeth, numbness in oral cavity, peripheral paresthesia. These clinical features were given and you had to diagnose. This is most likely due to. Now the options were hyperparathyroidism, hypoparathyroidism, hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism. So out of these, the best option was hypoparathyroidism.
This is covered under oral pathology and medicine, chapter oral aspects of metabolic diseases. We have a bite on hypo and hyperparathyroidism. The most important thing is we have to know the dental abnormalities. Coming to the hypo and hyperparathyroidism dental features. Now we'll see the hyperparathyroidism dental features. We have pulp stone, loosening of teeth. So you will have floating type of teeth, spacing of teeth, partial loss of lamina dura, pedial widening and delayed eruption. Other features here will be the brown tumor and mandibular tori and silolithiasis. Here in radiograph, you'll have a ground glass appearance. Now we'll come to the hypoparathyroidism features. Enamel hypoplasia will be the main feature. Delayed eruption, hypodontia, macrodontia, wide pulp chambers, blunt roots, dental malocclusion, ankylosis. Other features will be paresthesia of tongue, lip, alteration in the facial musculature. Coming back to the question again, patient had hypoplasia, microdontia, hypodontia, multiple unerupted teeth, numbness, and peripheral paresthesia. All these are given in bite, so we can get to a conclusive answer for hypoparathyroidism, which is responsible for proprioception. Options were A alpha, A beta, delta fibers, and C fibers. The best option here would be A alpha.
Now see, here in the subject physiology, chapter muscles and neuromuscular junction, topic type of nerve fibers. The bite is there, type of nerve fibers. Here very nicely, all the fibers are explained along with their origin, their function, their velocity and their diameter. Okay, see, here all are there. Like numerical type, type 1A, type 1B, it is in Langer and Gasser type, e.g. fiber type A alpha, A alpha. The origins are given here, like annulospiral endings of muscle spindle, Golgi tendon organ. Functions is proprioception. Now this was the question. Okay, proprioception, somatic motor. Velocities are also important, diameters also important. Okay, so here see all are given like A beta, flower spray endings, important question, flower spray endings, touch pressure. The function is touch pressure. Motor, 30 to 70 meter per second is the velocity, 5 to 12 micron diameter. Similarly, A delta is also given. These are the nociceptors of neospinothalamic tract, cold thermoceptor, free nerve endings of crude touch and pressure. Functions are pricking pain, cold, and crude touch. At least you should know the functions of each. Okay. And then C fibers. This is dorsal root, unmyelinated. C fibers are unmyelinated. This is also important. And these are the nociceptors of paleospinothalamic tract. A delta were the nociceptors of neospinothalamic tract. These are the nociceptor of paleospinothalamic tract, warmth receptor. The functions are slow pain, temperature, hot, crude touch, itch, and tickle. Okay, so you should learn this table. This is very nice table given in the bites, types of nerve fibers, the subject physiology. Now we'll see the question again. Which of the following is responsible for proprioception? Now see the option A alpha is the best option here. So this will be the answer.
0.45% salinous. Options are A. Hypertonic, B. Hypotonic, C. Isotonic, and D. Crystalloid. Now we have to see whether it's hypotonic, hypertonic, or isotonic, or it's a crystalloid.
Okay, so see 0.45% saline is hypotonic. The answer here is hypotonic. Okay, now see you can find it under in the bite. In bite, the fluids are important solutions commonly used are given very nicely. All the uses are given. So in surgery, subject surgery chapter, transfusion, shock, burns, and wound healing. Under the topic fluid management, there is a bite named fluid management. There you can find the important solutions which are used commonly. Now here you can find isotonic. Isotonic sodium chloride solution is given. Okay. Isotonic sodium chloride is 0.9%. Now in the question it was given as 0.45%. Okay. So that is having less concentration than the isotonic one. So that is hypotonic. Now this where it is used, what are the important characteristics of this isotonic sodium chloride solution? It is isotonic, contains sodium and chloride in the concentrations almost similar to that in the plasma. That's why it is isotonic. Okay. It should not be used in the first 24 hours after operation due to natural sodium conservation. One important fact is that it has a high concentration of chloride as compared to plasma and imposes an appreciable load of excess chloride on the kidneys that cannot be readily excreted. Similarly, other solutions are also there given in the bite. Go through those also. 5% dextrose, Ringer lactates, Darrow solutions. Important features of all these are there given in the bites. Now we'll see the question again. 0.45% saline is here asked, and I told you 0.9% is the normal saline. Okay, this is the normal saline. This is the normal saline, that is isotonic saline. This one is, so this is hypotonic. So here answer will be hypotonic. Now we have another question. Which of the following is not a crystalloid solution? So the options were Ringer's lactate, normal saline, dextrans, and the fourth option was glucose solution. So out of these, the answer was dextrans.
This topic has been covered in general surgery under the chapter transfusion, shock, burns, and wound healing, under the topic fluid management, and bite under fluids and electrolytes. We have to know what is crystalloid and what is a colloid. These crystalloids are always iso or hypertonic, whereas colloids are hypertonic. We have to know the examples. So what is this crystalloids? Crystalloids will expand the plasma volume for less time, and this colloids will expand the plasma volume for 2 or 4 hours. It is very cheap and it is expensive, and we have to know the examples. It is covered very nicely in this bite. So we'll see the examples of crystalloids. Examples are Ringer lactate, NS, normal saline, glucose solution, dextrose with normal saline, and hypertonic saline. If you see what are the colloids, dextrans, albumins, gelatins, hydroxyethyl starch, and blood replacements. Now coming back to the question, which of the following is not a crystalloid? So this is a crystalloid. This is normal saline is a crystalloid. Dextrins is colloids, and glucose solution. So the best option here would be dextrins are colloids and not crystalloids.
Now we have another question, like a clinical question. See, vanillyl mandelic acid is present in the urine of a newborn. Now, an enlarging lesion is present in the maxilla. On the basis of this, the diagnosis is asked. So it is, now options were there: neuroblastoma, PNET, melanocytic neuroectodermal tumor, gingival cyst of newborn. So out of these, the answer was PNET.
So this is covered in oral pathology under the strategy video, where vanillyl mandelic acid is present in the urine of a newborn. What is the diagnosis? So the diagnosis will be PNET. So what is this primitive neuroectodermal tumor? This is a primitive of Ewing sarcoma, and the main thing here is CD99 will be a prognostic marker, and in primitive neuroectodermal tumor patients, this vanil mandelic acid will be excreted in urine. By this, only by this evidence, we can come to a conclusion that this diagnosis is primitive neuroectodermal tumor. An IBQ was asked in the exam, identify the image. First option was file scaler, second option curate, third excavator, fourth hoe.
So here the answer was out of these file scaler. Okay, this was the image of a file scaler. Now you see, you get a similar question in the subject periodontology under the chapter implants and miscellaneous. Okay, see there was a question where two images were there, a chisel and file scaler, both were there. Okay, so out of these only this B image is asked in the exam, file scaler. Okay, so now you should know, see, hoe, chisel, and file scalers are used to remove tenacious subgingival calculus and altered cementum. It is their function, though their use is limited compared to that of curates. Files, they have a series of blades on a base. Their primary function is to fracture or crush large deposits of tenacious calculus. Now this is important. Their function is important. Okay, they are sometimes used for removing overhanging margins of dental restorations. You should be able to identify these two images of chisel scaler and file scaler. Okay, here A represents chisel scaler and B is of file scaler. Now, when we get back to the question, we see here what was asked. Here, identify the image. You had to identify the image correctly. Okay, so now I told you about the two images. Okay, see, file scaler, curate, excavator, and hoe. So out of these, the correct option will be file scaler.
4% glutaraldehyde is applied for how much time? Options were 5 seconds, 1 second, 4 minutes, and 2 minutes.
So here the answer was 2 minutes. Okay, so now see, similar question was there in a question bank, pediatric dentistry, under the chapter pediatric endodontics. A similar question was there which states like percentage of glutaraldehyde, the percentage of glutaraldehyde as a medicament during primary tooth pulpotomy is. So it was asking the percentage, 2%. Okay, so a similar question was there in the exam. Now we'll see glutaraldehyde pulpotomy. It is an alternative. Generally, it is used as an alternative to formoterol as a tissue fixative for vital pulpotomy. In the histologic studies, it has been shown that it produces rapid surface fixation of pulp tissue. Okay, but with limited depth of penetration. So a larger amount of radicular pulp tissue remains vital when glutaraldehyde pulpotomy is done. So fixed pulp tissue may be replaced with dense collagenous tissue over time, and studies have also demonstrated less systemic distribution than was with formoterol. So it is generally having some advantage over formoterol. Okay, it has also been shown to rapidly metabolize with little toxic effect, and also although glutaraldehyde has antigenic action similar to that of formoterol, that action is of lower potential.
So coming back to the question, it is asked 4% glutaraldehyde is applied for how much time? The best option here would be 2 minutes. And if at all they ask 8% glutaraldehyde is applied for how many minutes? It should be 5 seconds. Okay. So 4%, if 4% is asked, it should be 2 minutes. And if it's 8% is asked, it should be 5 seconds.
Now another question, see, action potential in skeletal muscles is due to A, voltage gated sodium channels, B, voltage gated potassium channels, C, ligand gated sodium channels, and D was ligand gated potassium channels. So the answer key here was voltage gated sodium channels.
We have this question in physiology under the chapter muscles and neuromuscular junction. We have a beautifully framed bite, neuromuscular junction, under the topic nerve conduction and NM junction. So basically the concept here is the sodium ions will get influx, which means after influx of sodium ions, the depolarization of the postsynaptic membrane will happen, causing the generation of local potential, that is the end plate potential. We call this as EPP. So what this EPP, after this EPP is done, it causes a current sink between the depolarized plate and the adjacent plasma membrane. So here is the EPP and the plasma membrane. After this, the action potential will be generated on both sides of the end plate, and this will spread to the muscle fiber. This will spread to the muscle fiber, and then it happens like binding of calcium to troponin C. So we have three types of troponin, right? So this calcium will bind to troponin C. So calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum cisternae due to opening of calcium channels caused by a conformational change in the voltage sensing dihydropyridine receptors. This DHP stands for dihydropyridine receptors, which will cause the uncovering of myosin sites on cutting formation of cross-linking. So there will be cross-linking between actin and myosin. So thereby the sliding of thick and thin filament will causing a motion. So basically your concept should be like, due to influx of this voltage gated sodium channels, this depolarization is started, and then you will have a EPP potential, that is end plate potential will be activated, and then only the sequence of events will take place. Coming back to the question, action potential in skeletal muscle is due to voltage gated sodium channels. You have another option C, ligand gated sodium channels. This is not a right answer, only this voltage gated sodium channels is right here.
Now here we have another question. It's a clinical question. So see, patient is unable to turn eye upwards after the mid-phase trauma with fracture and no sign of a PG. Now here we have to see the reason. Okay, so we'll see the options: trapped inferior rectus, herniation of orbital content, entrapment of fat, entrapment of superior oblique. So here the answer was trapped inferior rectus.
This is covered in general anatomy subject under extra cover. See, we have covered the actions of individual muscles. Question says downward rotation, medial rotation, and extorsion of eyeball is facilitated by which of the muscles? Superior rectus, inferior rectus, levator palpebrae superioris, and medial rectus. We have given the four options. Now we look into the action of individual muscles. Here in inferior rectus, it is facilitating the downward rotation, medial rotation, and extorsion. Likewise, we can see superior rectus also upward rotation, medial rotation, and intorsion. Levator palpebrae superioris is responsible for elevation of the upper eyelid. So we have seen the actions of individual muscles. Coming back to the question, patient is unable to turn upwards after the midface trauma with fracture and no sign on OPG. So the most common answer would be trapped inferior rectus. This is mostly due to the blowout fractures of the orbit, or this is due to the herniation of the inferior rectus. Most commonly it is due to the trapped inferior rectus, and the management would be the exploration of the orbit. We have a clinical question here. Patient comes to a dentist, complains of severe sensitivity. On examination, erosion of lingual side in the upper anterior teeth and generalized attrition was evident. What will be the probable diagnosis? So the first option was GERD, bulimia nervosa, typhoid, and Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. The answer key here is GERD.
Okay, now see, such a similar question was there in our oral pathology. A question was there, oral pathology subject, physical and chemical injuries. Now you see the question, loss of tooth surface because of chemomechanical action is known as abrasion, erosion, abstraction, and attrition. So answer was erosion. Now in the explanation, you can find the causes. Okay, dental erosion is defined as irreversible loss of dental hard tissue by a chemical process that does not involve bacteria. Now, dissolution of the mineralized tooth structure occurs upon contact with acids that are introduced into the oral cavity from intrinsic or extrinsic sources. Now, the intrinsic sources which are here mentioned, they are gastroesophageal reflux or vomiting. Now, here see the question. When we come back to the question, we see here the patient has come to the dentist, complains of severe sensitivity. Erosion on the lingual side in upper anterior teeth is seen. Now here the answer is GERD. Now I'll tell you what is there in GERD. GERD is gastroesophageal reflux disease. Now generally the sphincters are closed. Okay, now in these patients the sphincters are open, so the reflux of the acid from the stomach is there in the oral cavity. Now that leads to the erosion of the teeth on the lingual side. Okay, so this is the characteristic clinical presentation of GERD, the erosion on the lingual side and the upper anterior teeth, and generalized attrition may also be there, and severe sensitivity will also be there. So out of all these options, the answer will be GERD here. Now we have here another question where you have to select a combination of options. Okay. See, anterior mandibular expansion expensile lesion, which diagnosis is done by. Now diagnostic modalities are being asked here. Four options are there. See, one is biopsy, then FNAC, then CBCT, then aspiration. Now out of these, combinations are given below. Now out of these you have to select the correct combination. So first combination is the ACD, that is biopsy, CBCT and aspiration for anterior mandible expensile lesion. Second option is A and B, that is FNAC and biopsy. Third is A, B, C, that is biopsy, FNAC, CBCT. And the fourth combination is biopsy and aspiration. Okay. So here the answer is biopsy and aspiration, that is combination 4. That is A and D is the correct answer here.
So this question is covered in oral pathology, subject oral pathology under the chapter odontogenic cystin tumor. So the question mainly deals with the investigations, right? So the question was a 25-year-old male patient reports with a bony expansile lesions of the anterior right body of mandible. So here it's body of mandible and mild paresthesia. OPG shows a multilocular radiolucency without root resorption. What would be your next investigation of choice? Here, aspiration cytology was the investigation of choice. Aspiration of cystic fluids for diagnosis is obsolete as an investigation, but thick paste is found in a cyst is probably a keratin, indicates a OKC. Most cystic fluids are watery and opalescent, but sometimes viscid and yellowish. They are shimmer with cholesterol crystals. Cholesterol crystals are seen in radicular cyst. A smear of the cyst fluid may show notched cholesterol crystals microscopically. In infected cyst, an aspirate of pus should be taken for bacterial culture sensitivity. Coming back to the question, see, they haven't given the diagnosis, they have given only anterior mandible expansile lesion. So it could be either OKC or aneurysmal bone cyst. So we have to give a combination of investigations. We can choose biopsy to rule out the cystic fluid, like biopsy to just rule out whether it's a cyst or a tumor, and we can give aspiration to rule out the type of cystic fluid. So among the combinations, this biopsy and aspiration will be the best choice. We have another IBQ from oral surgery. Identify the image shown in the image below. So the options were external pin fixator for comminuted fractures of mandible. Second option was multi-vector mandibular distractor. Third option was rigid external distractor for maxilla. Fourth option was all of the above. The answer key here would be multi-vector mandibular distractor.
Okay. Now see, this question has been a direct pick from marathon. It was an oral surgery marathon. Okay. See, it is the direct question only that repeated in exams. The question was identify the device shown in the image below. The image was the same. The options were the same. External pin fixator for comminuted fractures of mandible, multi-vector mandibular distractor, rigid external distractor for maxilla, all of the above. So this is multi-vector mandibular distractor. You should be able to identify this from the picture. Okay. Now this multi-vector distractor, what is its function? It is used to perform multi-vector distraction, single vector distraction and bone transport. Okay. And this can be modified also for specific applications if the bone stock is present, limited bone. So it is modified accordingly. Okay. Independent lengthening of mandibular ramus and body is done. 3D manipulation of the external distraction mechanism for post-operative vector adjustment requires only a single osteotomy and 4 pin sites. Now coming back to the question, we'll see here again, once again, see the question, identify the device. You have to identify the image. You should know that this is a multi-vector mandibular distractor.
The question is, in a functional implant, bone loss seen annually after 1 year is, and the options are 0.15 to 2 millimeters, less than 0.1 millimeter, 1 to 2 millimeters, and 1 to 1.5 millimeters. Now let us try to understand the question. They are talking about a functional implant. That means it's a healthy implant, not a failing implant. Bone loss around the implant is a natural phenomenon. It is going to happen throughout the entire life of that implant. So the bone loss seen annually after 1 year of loading specifically is less than 0.1 millimeters. This is a very straightforward theoretical question which has to be remembered. So this is the same question that we have in the app. Exactly the same question that has been asked. The answer to this question is less than 0.1 millimeters.
Dr. Amir, is there any difference between an implant, the bone loss seen around an implant after 1 year and before 1 year?
Okay, yes. So that is also an important consideration that we need to remember. So before 1 year of loading, before 1 year, there is greater bone loss. So in the first year, the bone loss of approximately around 1.2 millimeters, according to Edel et al., and around zero point 0.2 millimeters, less than zero point 0.2 millimeters, according to Albertson et al. So these two values are also, they are not very identical values, but these are similar values, where it is said that if the first thread of the implant, that is from the crest to the first thread, if there is this much bone loss in the first year, then it is acceptable. If there is any greater bone loss than this, then that is a sign of peri-implant disease. Also, we need to remember that this bone loss is generally greater in maxilla as compared to mandible, because the density of maxillary bone is lesser. Mandibular bone is denser, that is why it is not very prone to resorption. So the range of this is around zero point 0.6 to 1.1 millimeters in general in the first year. So in the first year, the bone loss is around 1 millimeter, and after first year, it is around 0.1 millimeter. So the answer to this question is 0.1 millimeter, and the answer to your question is 1 millimeter. The question is, what should be the distance for the restoration with an implant? So here they are asking us the restorative space. Restorative space meaning how much should be the height of the crown. So we have the implant, then we have the abutment, and we have a crown on top of it. So they are asking is what they are asking is that how much should be the height, minimum height that we require for this kind of a clinical scenario. So the options here are 6 millimeters, 7 millimeter, 8 millimeters, and 9 millimeters. So this is again a direct question from Mish. They have explained very well with an image, which is also there in the app. The same question is there, and you can also find this image in our bytes. So here, let us try to analyze what is the situation and how do we get 8 millimeters of uh, restorative space. So this is the implant, and this is the implant collar. So at the crest is where you are going to calculate. So from the crest of the implant, the bone is around less than 1 millimeter. So 1 millimeter of bone level plus 5 millimeters of the crown with the abutment and cement retention, and the occlusal area has to be greater than 1 millimeter. So that means if it is a PFM crown, you need minimum 1.5 millimeter for the crown. So that is 1.5 millimeter approximately. So that sums up to 7.5 to 8 millimeters of restorative space. So in a cement retained crown, which is indicated for anterior restorations as shown in the figure, because the access hole doesn't come on the aesthetic side, it is difficult to achieve a palatal access hole for the screw retained restoration. So considering that, we can go ahead with 8 millimeters of restorative space.
Dr. Amir, you mentioned that cement retention, or this is a cement retained prosthesis. So, is there any difference between when it is cement retained and not cement retained?
Oh, okay, yes. So there are a few values on similar lines that we need to remember on the same front. Now, I spoke about cement retained restoration because it was an anterior case given in the clinical scenario. Now, the crown can either be a screw retained crown or a cement retained crown. A screw retained crown naturally requires lesser space because the cement space is completely gone and it is directly screwed to the implant. So it can be screwed in two ways. One is at the crestal level and one is at the abutment level. So if it is at an abutment level or implant level, then you need minimum restorative space of 4 millimeters, 4 to 5 millimeters, which is not there in the option. So they are hinting at a screw retained restoration so that we can pick up from the question. If it is an abutment level, then it is 7.5 millimeters, which we have already discussed. That means that it is attached. The crown measurement is supposed to be done from here if it is an abutment level screw retained restoration. So this is for screw retained restorations. Then for screw cement retained restoration that we discussed, it is around 7 to 8 millimeters. So again, both the answers fall in the same category. Then for other kind of prosthesis, so if it is an overdenture. If it is an unsplinted overdenture, what does an unsplinted overdenture mean? It means that they're attached by a locator. That means we have the ridge, we have one implant here, one implant here. There is one attachment here, one attachment here. On top of this, we have the denture. So for that, the amount of restorative space required, so unsplinted overdenture, you need around 7 millimeters of restorative space. For a bar supported overdenture, what is a bar supported overdenture? A bar supported overdenture means suppose there are 3 implants in the mandibular anterior area. They are all connected with each other with a bar. So we have the height of this abutment, the height of this bar, and the height of the denture. So naturally that will be a little greater. So that is around 11 millimeters because the bar has to be around 2 to 3 millimeters thicker. Okay, so this plus 2 to 3 millimeters gives us 10 millimeters and the height of the denture. And then if it is a hybrid screw retained prosthesis, that means if it is a metal framework plus acrylic, if it is directly screwed, for example, all on 4, all on 6, in that kind of a clinical scenario, you need a lot of space, restorative space, that is 15 millimeters restorative space to accommodate the metal framework and the acrylic. So to summarize, for a screw retained restoration, minimum restorative space is required, that is 4 to 5 millimeters. For a screw cement retained restoration, you need around 7 to 8 millimeters. And for the rest of them, you have to remember these values. The question is, bone sounding is used for. Now, bone sounding is an important clinical procedure which is done specifically to see the height of bone available. So the correct answer is bone height because that is a direct question. Let's try to understand the other options: attachment loss with periodontal defect, bone width, and bone density. Now, bone density is radiographically examined with the help of IOPA or CBCT. Then bone width cannot be understood with the help of bone sounding because you need to probe with the you need to probe for bone sounding. So width cannot be estimated, only the depth can be estimated. An attachment loss with periodontal defect would mean loss of attachment. So yes, probing technique we can use definitely for attachment loss, but that doesn't mean it is same as bone sounding. So bone sounding is thoroughly explained in the bites, and there are similar questions seen in the app as well. So you can refer the bites for bone sounding. Now let me try to explain or summarize to you what is bone sounding. Bone sounding is also known as transgingival probing. Transgingival probing meaning trans meaning via or from between. So from between the gingiva, the probe is inserted into the sulcus under local anesthesia, and this will help us determine the height of bone available in that area. And if you walk the probe at multiple points, then you can understand the architecture of bone in that area. So bone architecture, that means if there are any craters or osseous reduction. So in this figure, if you see here, while walking the probe in the sulcus transgingivally after applying local anesthesia, we understand that there is a crater here. So only the height can be determined, the width cannot be determined. That is the significance of bone sounding.
Is there any correlation with bone sounding and biological width?
Correct, yes. So now what is biological width firstly? So biologic width in a theoretical aspect means junctional epithelium plus connective tissue. So the total thickness of the epithelium and the connective tissue is the biologic width. Now clinically, how do you correlate? So from the deepest point of the gingival sulcus to the crest of bone. So that means from this part of the gingival sulcus to the crest. Now here the crest is here. So that means the biologic width here is different than the biologic width here. Now we need a minimum biologic width for a proper periodontal support to the tooth. If there is any violation of the biologic width, that means we are going to see more periodontal changes in form of recession and bone loss. So this helps us understand the amount of biologic width or the attached mucosa to the tooth. Also, this plays an important role not only in periodontics but also as a prosthetic point of view, because if there is not enough clinical crown height, then we need to reduce the amount of gingiva around the tooth. While reducing that gingiva, we need to do bone sounding to understand whether we need to do osseous reduction to maintain the biologic width, or we have to just do a gingivectomy to maintain the biologic width. So yes, biologic width and bone sounding can also be correlated very well. The question is, sub-antimicrobial dose of doxycycline is, and the options are 20 milligrams, 60 milligrams, 80 milligrams, and 150 milligrams. Now, this is a direct question from Karanza. This is referring to Periostat, which is 20 milligrams of doxycycline hyclate, and it is the answer to this is 20 milligrams of doxycycline. This question is there in our practice test, and you can find it in the bites as well. It's a direct question.
What is the role of sub-antimicrobial dose of doxycycline? Like, what is the importance of it?
Okay, so let us try to understand this word sub-antimicrobial. That means we are not giving a complete dose. Like the ideal dose for doxycycline at an antimicrobial therapeutic agent is around 100 milligrams, which is used for acne and other systemic conditions. So here we are using a smaller dose twice daily. And the role of using doxycycline is that it is going to regulate the matrix metalloproteins, which are basically the destructive enzymes in the periodontal pathogenesis. So it regulates that, and this is given as an adjunct. That means as an addition to scaling and root planing therapy. So after you have thorough oral prophylaxis done with deep scaling, then doxycycline can be given. So this is a kind of a host modulation therapy, and it is very commonly routinely practiced and scientifically backed. So this is a very important question. Doxycycline subclinical dose is 20 milligrams. The question is, identify the class of recession as per Miller's. So we have a clinical image where there is recession seen on the canine, and they have asked us what is the class of recession. So the options are class 1, 2, 3, and 4. That is the Miller's classification. And the answer to this is with the understanding of how Miller's classification works. So we have explained this thoroughly in the bites and in the questions as well. So class 1 is where we have soft tissue recession, which does not extend to the mucogingival junction. In class 2, we have soft tissue recession, which may or may not extend to the mucogingival junction, but there is no attachment loss. Unlike class 3, in class 3, there is loss of interdental tissue and there is loss of attachment. So the recession may extend up to the mucogingival junction, but there is an interdental papilla which is lost, or there is other tissue loss associated with the malposition of the tooth. And finally, class 4 is a severe form of recession where there is thorough bone loss and there is absolute destruction of the periodontal structures. So now coming back to the image, we see that here the mucogingival junction must be somewhere here. So it is not extending up to the mucogingival junction. So that means it is either class 2 or class 3. Now in class 3, like I said, interdental papilla would be destructed or there would be malpositioning of the tooth. So because there is preservation of the interdental papilla, this is only a soft tissue recession that is extending just up to the mucogingival junction. That is why the best answer to this would be class 2. The question is, absorbable suture among the following is, and the options are silk, nylon, polyglycolic, and Dacron. So this is a very straightforward question. According to the classification of suture materials, the answer to this is polyglycolic acid, which is explained thoroughly in the bites, and there are multiple questions that have come over the last few years on this topic. So what is polyglycolic? Polyglycolic is an absorbable suture, which is the question. Okay, it is braided. That means it is multifilament. These are a few things that you need to remember according with regards to polyglycolic acid. It has a good rate of absorption. That means it stays for longer time and that it allows proper tension between the two approximating ends. Rate of absorption and little inflammation. So this is a homocopolymer of glycolic acid and it is very routinely used. The answer to this is polyglycolic, which is an absorbable suture. The question is, Vicryl 30 is an absorbable natural suture, or is it an absorbable synthetic suture, or is it non-absorbable natural suture, or is it non-absorbable synthetic suture? Now let's try to understand what is Vicryl. Vicryl is nothing but lactic acid and polyglycolide. So it is an absorbable suture. That means it is either of 1 or 2, A or B. Now it is not natural, it is a synthetic suture. It goes by the classification. So the answer to this is absorbable synthetic suture. The number 30 here shows the thickness of the needle, gauge of the needle. So higher the number, thinner is the needle. This material is specifically used for soft tissue reconstruction, for papilla regeneration, and for periodontal procedures in aesthetic areas. It stays for up to 56 to 70 days, has a very good tissue reaction, has minimal inflammatory reaction, and it is also available in a monofilament form, so the plaque accumulation on it is minimal. So the answer to this is polyglycolic acid is an absorbable synthetic suture, which is also seen in this question has come repeatedly. It's there in the app. You can go through the bytes for this question. Now the question here is, which of the following is Kennedy's class 6? Okay, let's try to understand what is Kennedy's class 6. Let's go through the options first. It is a unilateral edentulous area with natural teeth remaining both anterior and posterior to it. Okay, this is class 6, but this is an incomplete form of class 6. This is Kennedy's class 3. Single but bilateral crossing the midline edentulous area located anterior to the remaining natural teeth. This is Kennedy's class 4. Edentulous area bounded anteriorly and posteriorly by natural teeth, but in which anterior abutment is not suitable. This is Kennedy's class 5. And lastly, edentulous area in which teeth adjacent to the space are capable of total support of required prosthesis. Yes, this is Kennedy's class 6. Now, technically talking, Kennedy has given only 4 classifications. That is Kennedy's class 1 to class 4. The first two being distal extension cases, class 3 being a tooth-bound edentulous area, and class 4 is anterior edentulous area, which crosses the midline. This question has is explained in the bytes, thoroughly explained in the bytes, and it is also there in the video. So in Kennedy's class 6, it is technically a Kennedy's class 3 situation only, where you have an anterior tooth present and a posterior tooth present. But the only specialty in Kennedy's classification, now this is not technically Kennedy's classification, it is called Kennedy Applegate classification. So Kennedy's class 5 and class 6 are a part of Kennedy Applegate classification. In Kennedy's class 6, we have both the abutment teeth which are strong enough to give support, or which are capable of giving good support for the restoration. So that is Kennedy's class 6.
How is Kennedy's class 6 different from class 5?
Okay, so in the option 3, which was given in the question, they said that the anterior tooth is not capable of giving support. So now consider in the same clinical scenario, if this premolar was missing, and suppose if this canine is also missing. So you have the lateral as the anterior abutment and the molar as the posterior abutment. So this lateral is a very small abutment, and it is not morphologically sound to support 3 teeth if you have to restore them. So it is not a very favorable kind of a situation. Kennedy Applegate 5 and 6 both are modifications of Kennedy's class 3. Modification is not the correct word technically. They are just an upgradation of Kennedy's class 3 because they are also tooth bound areas. So in 5, the anterior abutment cannot give support. It could be periodontally compromised, or it could be the morphology of that tooth. In Kennedy's class 6, both anterior and posterior can provide supports. That is the difference between Kennedy's class 5 and Kennedy's class 6. The question is, a single bilateral edentulous area which is crossing the midline located anterior to the remaining natural teeth is Kennedy's class 1, class 2, class 3 or class 4. Now this is a direct question of Kennedy's classification. If it is an anterior edentulous area bilaterally present crossing the midline, then it is Kennedy's class 4. This has been thoroughly explained in the video in bytes. There are a lot of questions on this topic in the data that we have. So let us try to understand what is Kennedy's class 4. So you have your midline here. So it is a bilateral edentulous area anterior to the remaining natural teeth present. So these are the remaining natural teeth. These are the remaining natural teeth, and anterior to that is the edentulous area, which is Kennedy's class 4. Now, what is the confusing part here? Suppose if in this same clinical scenario, if you have your teeth present till here, suppose if incisors are present, the canine is present, and only one side of the edentulous area is to be considered. If it is not crossing the midline, then even though it is anteriorly there, it is only unilateral, and therefore it is Kennedy's class 3. Okay, so this we can understand like a top up on this question, that if it is not crossing the midline, then it is a Kennedy's class 3. Also, according to the Applegate's rule, we have to remember the rule number 8, that there are no modifications of Kennedy's class 4, because rule number 5 says that the posterior most edentulous area determines the classification. So these are a few questions on similar lines with Kennedy's class 4, and this is a very straightforward direct question. The question is, anterior guidance can be modified by all except, and the options are contour lingual surfaces of upper incisor, increase the vertical dimension at occlusion, decrease the vertical dimension at occlusion, incisal edges of lower incisor. So
What do we understand by anterior guidance?
Yeah, so that is exactly what I wanted to come to. That anterior guidance is technically something that a lot of people get confused with. So to understand anterior guidance, close your teeth in maximum intercuspation. You can do it with me. And then when you come in protrusion, you will understand that your lower incisors are coming and sliding across the lingual inclines of or the palatal inclines of your upper incisors. So this anterior, the amount of anterior steepness that you are coming forward, which is governed by the slopes of the maxillary central incisor, the incisal edges, the overbite, the overjet. This together comprises the angle which is called the anterior guidance angle. So the question here is, which of the following will not modify this anterior guidance? So upper incisors, the contour of the lingual surfaces is going to definitely affect the anterior guidance. Then incisal edge of the lower incisors is also going to affect. That leaves us with the two options, which is increased vertical dimension and decreased vertical dimension. Now, decreased VDO would mean that their teeth are closer, the anteriors are closer to each other, and increased VDO would mean that they are far away from each other. Now, if you are increasing the vertical dimension at occlusion, the occlusion is for the posterior teeth. If you are increasing that, then you are probably creating an anterior open bite. Now, in an open bite, there is no anterior guidance because it is naturally missing. The teeth are not coming in contact with each other. There is no sloping of the lower anteriors against the upper anteriors. So, with the increase in vertical dimension at occlusion, we get an open bite, and that is why the answer to this would be increase in vertical dimension at occlusion. So, anterior guidance cannot be modified by increasing the vertical dimension at occlusion. So, I hope this is understood. This is explained in detail in the bites and in the video on occlusal corrections in FPD, where anterior teeth and the anterior guidance can be affected by the reduction in the lower incisal edges or by deepening the lingual fossa of the upper teeth and reducing the incisal edges of the lower teeth. So this is the option C, this is option A, and this is option D. So this is explained in the bites and we can correlate it in the clinical scenario. The question is, tetracycline is incorporated in which of the following? So they've given us 4 drugs as the option. The first one is Acticite. Acticite is tetracycline periodontal, which is the answer given in Carranza, also explained in the bites. Then Atridox is nothing but doxycycline. And then Arestin is minocycline microspheres. And dentamycin is 2% minocycline gel. So the correct answer is tetracycline periodontal. This is also similar question is also there in the bites in the question bank. So you can use these questions also for reference.
But aren't all the options technically tetracycline?
Yes, technically all of them are tetracyclines, that is minocycline, doxycycline. They are all tetracyclines only. But since the question was asked as tetracycline is incorporated, the closest answer is Acticide because that is tetracycline periodontal. So this is only for periodontal use and this is the closest answer. That is why we will select A as the answer.
So this question is regarding Dean's fluorosis index. The question is, according to Dean's fluorosis index, severe fluorosis is seen in first, brown stains which are widespread and teeth present a corroded-like appearance with discrete or confluent pitting. Second, white opaque areas in the enamel of the teeth which are extensive but do not involve as much as 50% of the tooth. Third, teeth showing no more than 1 to 2 mm of white opacity at the tip of the summit of the cusp of the bicuspid or second molars. And fourth, enamel discloses slight aberrations from translucency of normal enamel ranging from few white flecks to occasional white spots. Now, this is a very direct question on Dean's fluorosis index. If you know the different criteria of the index, you'll be able to come to the answer very easily. That is brown stains which are seen on the teeth, which are widespread and they present a corroded-like appearance. This topic has been covered extensively in our bites under the topic of fluoride toxicity. Different images are also given to explain the different criteria better for better understanding. Now coming to what are the different criteria of Dean's fluorosis index. So as we know, Dean's fluorosis index has 6 criteria ranging from normal, questionable, mild, very mild, mild, moderate, severe. So if you see this, this is severe. White opaque areas not covering 50% of the tooth, that is mild. Teeth showing no more than about 1 to 2 mm of white opacity at the tip of the summit of the cusp. So these are all important keywords that you need to remember, which will get you to the answer directly. Now this is very mild, and slight enamel slight aberrations from translucency with white flecks and occasional white spots is questionable.
Dr. Khadija, you just mentioned that there are 6 scales of Dean's fluorosis index, but there was some modification, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Okay, so the original Dean's index, which was given in 1934, that had a 7 scale of criteria that contained normal, questionable, very mild, mild, moderate, moderately severe, and severe. However, in 1942, the index was was modified, and in this modification, it became a 6-point scale instead of a 7-point scale, where moderately severe and severe categories were combined. Which of the following represents the mandibular nerve block? A, B, C, or all of the above? The answer here is all of the above, because we know A is the Go-Gates technique, B is the IANB technique, and C is the Akinosi-Vazirani technique. So the answer here is
Sorry
all
to
of the above.
interrupt, doctor. Based on only the images, how can we be so conclusive? Because here they've not mentioned anything about open mouth or closed mouth. They've only shown the image of the bone and the needle.
Yeah. So in this image, we have to understand the position of the needle and the syringe to identify which technique it is. So in the IANB and the Go-Gates technique, the needle is inserted into the target area from the opposite side. That is, if we want to, if the target area is on the left, this syringe will be from the right side of the patient. So on the opposite side. Now, how will we? So in basis on that, we can exclude Akinosi Vazirani because this is from the same side. And also another thing about this technique is that the level of the syringe or the level of the needle is parallel to the maxillary occlusal plane. So we know this is Akinosi Vazirani. Now between Go-Gates and IANB, the target area for Go-Gates technique is lateral to the neck of the condyle. So here we know this is lateral to the neck of the condyle, so this is the Go-Gates technique. Whereas in the IANB, the target area is much below. It is around 6 to 10 mm above the mandibular occlusal plane and parallel to it. So we know that this is the IANB technique. The various techniques for LA have been given very well and explained very well in our bites under the topic of local anesthesia. This can be found in the oral surgery subject. In this question, the inability of a child to close his lips at rest and while he is smiling is known as incompetent, competent, potentially incompetent, or everted lips. Now the answer here is the answer here we can reach is because he says at rest and while smiling. So at rest and in function at both times the child is not able to close his lips. So based on the classification which is given by Ballard and Tooley, which is also mentioned in our bites in the topic of diagnosis, the classification is very well explained with all the images. Here we know that competent lips are those where the lips are in slight contact. Now, some amount of lip opening is normal even at rest. This is seen even in competent lips, where up to 4 millimeter of interlabial distance at rest is considered normal. If it is beyond 4 mm, that is when we say it is incompetent. This is usually seen in those patients who have morphologically short lips and cannot form a lip seal. So in this patient, we know that at rest as well as while smiling, he is not able to close his lips. So that means they are incompetent. Potentially incompetent lips are those where they can form a lip seal, but because there is some obstruction in achieving the lip seal, for example, if they are severely proclined incisors, that's when the lip seal cannot happen. So in those cases, we'll call them as potentially incompetent lips. And everted lips are those where there is hypertrophy of the lip musculature. So the lips appear rolled over.
So, doctor, why cannot we go with the answer of potentially incompetent lips in this question?
Because here they have not mentioned anything regarding his teeth, his dentition. They haven't mentioned anything of that sort. So in this situation where it is vague, where they're just saying that there is inability to close his mouth. Inability is the key word. He is not
Mm,
able to close his mouth. He's not able to close his lips. So that will give us the answer of incompetent lips. If he
okay.
had the potential to close but could not close it because of an obstruction, in those cases there will be potentially incompetent.
Potential incompetent lips. Okay.
Maximum fluoride releases out of the following is silver alloy admix, CERMIT, type 1 GIC or type 3 GIC. Now this is a very direct question. If you see, a table is there even in Philips, and the similar table is also present in our bytes in the topic of GIC in dental materials. If you see this table from the different values that are given, we can see that silver alloy admix has a maximum fluoride release as compared to the other options.
Doctor, is there any specific reason that we can say that Cermet has less fluoride releasing capacity?
Okay, so CERMIT is nothing but GIC which is reinforced with silver particles. But in this, they are sintered. So in CERMIT, what happens is the silver particles, they coat over the fluoride particles of the GIC, and hence they are not available to leach out. Whereas in silver alloy admix, which is also known as miracle mix, here the silver particles are not sintered into the GIC. So the fluoride particles are free to leach out, and hence the fluoride releasing capacity of silver alloy admix is the highest. Which of the following pairs is correctly matched? The speech affected and the abnormality. So here we have to see that the speech which is affected, whether it is correctly correlated with the malocclusion that is given. Consonants with class 3 malocclusion, labiodental fricatives with posterior open bite, linguodental fricatives anterior open bite, or linguoalveolar stops with class 2 division 1. Now here the correct answer is linguodental fricatives with an anterior open bite. To understand this question, we need to know what are the different speech and how are they created. Consonants are nothing but sounds which are created when there is complete or partial closure of the vocal tract. Now, in a class 3 malocclusion, this is not going to get affected. Labiodental fricatives are sounds which are produced by the lips and the teeth meeting, such as f and v. Now, in a posterior open bite, the lips and the teeth that are required for producing this sound are not affected. So, this is not true. Linguodental fricatives are those sounds which are produced by placing the tip of the tongue at the anteriors, upper anteriors to create sounds such as th. Now, in an anterior open bite, depending upon the severity, this relationship can be affected and this speech can be distorted. So, the correct answer here is the linguodental fricative. Linguoalveolar stops are sounds like t and d, where the tongue meets the alveolar bone. So, in class 2 division 1, this is not going to be affected. To know which sounds are affected with which malocclusion, a similar question was even given in a question bank. So you can practice these, and the explanation is also given very well. In this table, you can see which sounds are affected with which malocclusion. For example, sibilants are affected with an anterior open bite or spaces, linguoalveolar stops when there is lingually placed maxillary incisors, labiodental fricatives are affected in skeletal class 3, and linguodental fricatives are affected when there is an anterior open bite.
Doctor, is there any diagnostic or prognostic value to this assessment?
Yes. So it is important to know whether the speech defect that a patient comes to you with, is it related to his malocclusion or it is not related to his malocclusion. This is very important to diagnose right at the beginning, because we need to know whether the orthodontic therapy is going to improve his speech defect or it is not going to have any effect on his speech. If a patient comes to you with a lisp and you see that he has an anterior open bite, you know that these two problems are related. So you know that if you close the anterior open bite, the speech problem is going to become better. However, if a patient comes to you with a lisp and he does not show any anterior open bite or any spaces, or if there is any other speech defect that the patient comes to you and it is not related to his malocclusion as it should be, then we know that the orthodontic therapy is not going to have any effect to correct his speech. and this is something we need to know right at the beginning. Facial vein drains into A. Internal jugular vein, B. External jugular vein, C. Anterior division of the retromandibular vein, or D. Transverse cervical vein. Now, here the answer is internal jugular vein. We know that the supratrochlear and supraorbital veins of the face, they unite at the medial angle of the eye and form the angular vein. Supratrochlear and supraorbital. They combine to form the angular vein. The angular vein continues as the facial vein. It then unites with the anterior division of the retromandibular vein. So this is where the option C can be confusing to some students. However, what we need to know is that the facial vein combines with the anterior division of the retromandibular vein to form the common facial vein, which ultimately drains into the internal jugular vein. So the answer is internal jugular vein. You can also find a simple mnemonic to remember this, which is given in our bites under the topic of venous supply of head and neck. Identify the image. So in this question, an instrument has been given and we need to identify it. Let's look at the options. A. Distal end cutter. B. Johnson plier. C. Bracket positioner. Or D. Matthews plier. Now to answer this question, we need to know how all of these options actually look like. We can find the images and the uses of all of these different appliances in our bites or in the subject of orthodontics in removable and fixed appliances. So all the different instruments along with their uses are explained very beautifully. Coming to the question, this is a distal end cutting forceps. What is a distal end cutting forceps used for? So in orthodontics, after a wire has been placed, there is some amount of wire that is going to protrude out from the distal aspect of the molar tube. So this instrument is used to trim off that excess or to cut off the excess wire that is protruding distally. That's why distal end plier. How do we identify it? If you look at the beaks of the distal end plier, it has a very characteristic L-shaped slots. And if the wire goes between this and when the beaks are closed, the wire just snaps. An interesting fact about the distal end plier is that most of these pliers come with a safety feature, meaning when the wire is cut, this piece doesn't just fly into the oral cavity of the patient. The plier holds onto that piece of wire so that it can be removed safely out of the mouth of the patient. True about Tannerella forsythia is 1. Gram positive and aerobic. 2. Gram negative and anaerobic. 3. Gram negative and motile. Or 4. Gram positive and anaerobic. Now the correct answer is gram negative and anaerobic. A similar question is also present in our question bank. A few things we need to know about Tannerella forsythia is that it is a gram negative anaerobic, strictly anaerobic bacteria from the Captocygophaga family. And why is it important? Is because along with P. gingivalis and T. denticola, it forms the red complex. And it is implicated in gingival bleeding in children, bleeding on probing, and also many chronic periodontal conditions. Aldosterone acts mainly on 1. DCT or the distal convoluted tubule, PCT or the proximal convoluted tubule, collecting duct or the loop of Henle. Now the correct answer here is the collecting duct. A similar question is also present in our question bank and can be revised. Now we know that aldosterone acts mainly to increase the reabsorption of sodium and increases the secretion of potassium in the renal tubules. Now in the collecting duct especially, there are principal cells which are present and they are responsible for the reabsorption of sodium and the excretion of potassium. And the rate of reabsorption of these ions is in turn controlled by aldosterone. Therefore, in this answer, aldosterone mainly acts on the collecting duct. Striations in skeletal muscle is due to A. Actin and myosin, B. Troponin C, titin, or D. Collagen. Now the answer here is A, actin and myosin. Actin and myosin are nothing but contractile proteins which form the myofilaments. This has been explained very well in our bites under the topic of neuromuscular junction. So here we can see that the myofibrils are of two types: actin, which is a thin myofibril, and myosin, which is a thick myofibril. The arrangement of the actin and myosin is what gives the characteristic striated appearance, like this. So the thick band is the myosin and the thin band is the actin. When these overlap, this is what creates the striations that we see. The A band is nothing but the myosin bands which are arranged. So they are the thick bands and so they appear dark and they are known as the A bands or the dark bands. Whereas the actin filaments, they are the thin bands, they are the light bands, and the area which is in which the myosin does not overlap the actin, that is this part. This is the I band or the light bands. In between the A band, there is an area in which the actin and the myosin are not overlapped. That is this area. This is known as the H zone or the light zone, which we can appreciate even in this image. So the configuration of the actin and the myosin and their overlapping is what creates these dark and light zones, which gives the muscle its characteristic striated appearance.
The question is regarding marginal ridge contact, all are true except. So they are asking us which of the following is false. The options are it causes playing of anterior teeth, it interferes with forward arc of placement, it helps in balanced occlusion, and it reduces the chances of fracture of the rest. So now let us try to understand what the question is. So now suppose if this is a molar and this is the edentulous space, and suppose if you are creating a rest seat over here, okay. So in this, if there is an adjacent tooth present, then they're asking us what is the configuration of this, like what is going to happen because of this marginal ridge preparation. So if you are doing a rest seat preparation, you are definitely going to prepare the marginal ridge. Now the rest seats can be of three types. It can be on posterior teeth, so they are occlusal rest seats, or canine, or incisors. So if they are on canine or incisors, they are crescent shaped, extending on the marginal ridge of one side of the tooth to the marginal ridge on the other side of the tooth. So if suppose this is your canine, then they're going to extend on the marginal ridge mesially and distally. So because of this, there is a thrusting force which causes widening of the teeth. That means they are splayed out. So the first option is true. It causes splaying of anterior teeth. This is the main reason why rest seats are not preferred on incisors, because they tend to procline a little. There is a torque that comes on the tooth because of the forces on the marginal ridge. Now the second option is it interferes with forward arc of placement. Now this could possibly be wrong because this is a desirable thing. We need to create a marginal ridge contact because it is going to preserve the integrity of the tooth, and it is a desirable thing. So it is not going to interfere with the arc of placement. Arc of placement meaning that when the patient is going to wear the denture in the mouth, it is not going to interfere because this is not towards the intaglio surface. It is actually supporting, it is reinforcing the strength to the tooth. It helps in balanced occlusion, which is true because if you consider, say, for example, an embrasure clasp is the one where you have one common rest seat between two teeth and there is a clasp like this. This is indicated in tooth bound areas. So here the marginal ridges are prepared on both the teeth, and that is where the occlusal contact of the antagonist tooth will come. So that is a desirable contact. In removable prosthodontics, we need balanced occlusion. We need a simultaneous tooth contact in excursive movement, which can be provided with the help of the marginal ridge contact. That is why this is correct. So option A is correct. Option C is correct. Reduces the chance of fracture of the rest, which is also a characteristic feature of these rests. The rests have to be around 1.5 to 2 millimeters thick. That is why they are rigid and they will not allow any chances of fracture in that area. So again, this is correct. So marginal ridge contact does not interfere with the forward arc of placement. So the answer is B. There is a similar kind of question which is there in our question bank, and the explanation is given in bytes under the topic of rest, direct retainers, and indirect retainers. So here the question that was asked is how much should be the preparation for this area where the marginal ridge is going to be. So the marginal ridge area needs to be around 2 millimeters prepared to incorporate the strength for the metal in that area, and so that it does not fracture. Otherwise, the chances of fracture of this rest is high. So you can read this topic in the bytes and you can solve similar questions in the question bank. The question is identify the appliance. So they've given this image over here. There are a few tips of some instrument and we have to identify what kind of an instrument this is. So it says sinus lift elevation instrument, okay. Then piezoelectric surgery instrument, okay. Titanium insert and carbide insert. Now this can be a little tricky question if we don't know exactly what the instruments are specifically meant to be. These are piezoelectric surgery instruments. Now piezoelectric works on the principles of vibrations. So there are micro vibrations that occur and they are used for bone surgeries. They are also used for sinus lift surgeries. So in sinus lift surgery, when you want to increase the height of the bone available, so if this is your crest of the alveolar bone and this is the proximity of the sinus, then you create a lateral window, you push this sinus up and you graft this area. So in creating this window to cut this bone, this kind of instrument is used because it provides a very good tactile feel and the cutting is very precise. So these tips which are seen in the image are called inserts. That's why I told you it could be a confusing instrument to identify. Now, sinus lift elevation instrument is not the correct terminology. That is why we will not go with that answer. And piezoelectric surgery is the actual equipment itself. So that is the more correct or the more appropriate answer. Now, the inserts that I'm talking about are the tips. These inserts can be either sharp inserts or blunt inserts or smoothing inserts. These are the three types of piezoelectric inserts. So if you see, there are a few sharp ones, there are these smoothing ones, there is a blunt one. So these are different types of inserts. These inserts can be coated with titanium or diamond. So the correct answer to this question is piezoelectric surgery instrument. The same question exactly is present in the question bank. So if you have solved the question bank, you must have come across the same image and the answer is piezoelectric surgery instrument. The question is, what is bracing? And the options are the component of one force is counteracted by the component of the other force. The component of one force is counteracted by the component of the same force. Component which resists occlusal forces and component which contributes to retention. Now bracing is associated with direct retainers of cast partial denture. In layman terms, bracing means to hug or to completely encircle something. So now suppose if we consider the configuration of a clasp, of an occlusally approaching clasp, this is the retentive arm and this is the reciprocal arm. Now the purpose of the retentive arm is to provide retention. That is why the tip of the retentive arm will go and engage beneath the survey line, that is beneath the suprabulge, and the reciprocal arm will stay above the suprabulge and it will just balance the forces of the retentive arm. So what happens is because the retentive arm is going and engaging beneath the bulk of the tooth, the highest bulk of the tooth, it is going to have a torquing effect on the tooth. That is why these forces are detrimental and they have to be counteracted or they have to be balanced. So to balance that, if this is buccally placed, then lingually you have a reciprocal arm which is going to not permit this kind of a torquing effect. So if one side the retentive arm is pushing the tooth, on the other side the reciprocal arm is going to brace the tooth and not allow the forces to work on that tooth. So it is a action reaction kind of a situation. So here the answer is A because it says that the component of one force is counteracted by the component of the other force. So if retentive force is, if the force from the retentive arm is considered as one force, then the reciprocal arm is going to counteract that force. So the answer is A. Now there is a similar question here. Bracing of RPD framework can be best obtained by a rigid reciprocal arm and the body of clasp. So reciprocation is also a synonym for bracing. That is why this is an important characteristic feature in designing a cast partial denture. In this question, they are asking us which of the following muscle elevates the posterior part of the tongue. So here they are specifically talking about elevation of the posterior part of the tongue. If this is the tongue, the posterior part. which muscle elevates this area? So the options are genioglossus of one side. Okay, so the genioglossus is somewhere anterior. Hyoglossus and styloglossus of both sides, which are both on the other side simultaneously. Styloglossus and stylopharyngeus of both sides, which is also in the same location, and palatoglossus, which connects the tongue to the palate, soft palate. So the option here is palatoglossus. This is a direct question. The answer is directly from BD Chaurasia, also explained in the whites. So in this table, if you see palatoglossus, it is capable of elevating the posterior tongue by depressing the soft palate. So posterior part of the tongue is depressed, which is the question, and the posterior part is elevated, and this is because of the depression of the soft palate, which is what is asked in the question. Which is a also palatoglossus is a narrow crescent-shaped musculature present in that area. So you can go through the bites. There are similar questions also on this same topic where each muscle, genioglossus, hyoglossus, these are all very important questions. Musculature of tongue. So palatoglossus has to be understood thoroughly.